is a very popular word these days. Okay, so it's evidence-based this, evidence-based that. So we're going to talk about not only assessment, but we're going to talk some about evidence-based interventions. A lot of misinformation about that. So we'll try to clear some things up. Hopefully, you'll gain some insight, since you're a school psychologist, into assessment, and some maybe you might use. One thing I will say, I will be mentioning some assessment instruments. They are just selected assessment instruments. There are many others, but we're going to talk about psychometrics and choosing your instruments based on good psychometric values. Okay, so with that, we can start. Presentation overview. We're going to compare and contrast DSM and IDEA. Very important. We're going to talk a little bit about a multi-tier strategy to screen at-risk students. We're going to list the domains of a comprehensive developmental assessment. That's one of the things I really want to spend some time on, is just that, a comprehensive development assessment for autism. Evidence-based screening and assessment instruments, and we're going to look at some research reviews and talk about some evidence-based interventions as well. Here's what we know. There's a lot more we don't know than we do know, but I've listed some here. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's not an emotional disorder. It's not an illness. It's not a disease. Now, we all know that. But if you've read some medical journals, or if you've looked at medical journals, it's quite disturbing to me to see that autism is still often referred to as a disease. Of course, it is not. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. Autism has no racial, ethnic, or social boundaries. Doesn't discriminate. Autism is estimated to affect more than 2 million individuals. Family and twin studies indicate that the majority of risk is from genetic factors, heritability. Very large study published last year, 2 million individuals in 7 countries found that approximately 80 to 90% of the risk is genetic, based on genetic factors. Autism tends to aggregate in families. But what's interesting to me, how often do you hear that? What you hear about is the other 10%, environmental factors, which we know little about in terms of real evidence. For example, popular media has, I'm going to use air quotes, so forgive me, has linked pesticides, overweight parents, okay, coal fumes, pesticides, pollution, low birth weight, cesarean birth, and yes, circumcision. Now that's what parents hear. It's our job as school psychologists and as educators to educate parents about some of these factors, the environmental factor that most parents, and indeed the public, hears about. The factors I just mentioned to you, they're usually mentioned. The studies are very flawed, debunked. Oh, did I mention vaccines? I don't know if you saw this. This was, I think it was last week in the Palm Beach Post. There's, it's not a letter to the editor, but people can write in and ask questions of various specialists. In this case, it's a veterinarian, who I believe his name was Dr. Fox. A grandparent wrote my grandson has just been diagnosed with autism. And my doctor told me it was really genetic, not due to vaccines. So here was her question to Dr. Fox. Is it possible when dogs are vaccinated that they might get autism? Is that possible? And of course, Dr. Fox responded, we have no evidence that dogs can develop autism from vaccinations. So it's comforting to know that your dog will not develop autism from vaccinations. It's amusing to some sense, but it does show that there are still a number of people and individuals who are misinformed about vaccines and autism. And I've had parents insist that their child's autism was caused by vaccine, heavy metal, and metals, and many other factors. So, unfortunately, the genetic piece gets very little attention. Most of it's environmental. Autism commonly co-occurs with other developmental, neurological, psychiatric diagnoses, and a little later we'll talk about comorbidity, very important in assessment. Very important in assessment, talk about that. CDC statistics. We all love CDC. 1 in 59. And this is another thing I explain to parents when parents say, my gosh, 1 in 59. Now I've heard it's 1 in 40. Anybody heard that it's 1 in 40? No? Okay. The Department of Health, Government Department of Health Services, I believe, sent out a questionnaire to a sample of parents, asking whether their child had been diagnosed or they thought their child had autism or were being treated for symptoms of autism. And the prevalence was 1 in 40. So we saw that in the media also. And of course, that's a questionnaire. And we have no way of verifying the diagnoses, obviously, because it's a questionnaire. 1 in 59. That is not a national representative sample. Everybody knows that. Often parents don't know that. It's from 11 sites throughout the country. Anyone know what state has the highest autism prevalence? No, oddly enough. New Jersey. New Jersey. How about the lowest? It's not Florida, but you know, it's Arkansas. Yeah, New Jersey is 3%, Arkansas. All right. But these statistics are based on 11 sites throughout the country. So it's not a representative sample. We don't have a representative sample. But officials at the CDC would say that they feel that this underrepresents the prevalence of autism in the US, even though we don't have an overall representative sample, because that's important. Boys are 4 times more likely to be identified with ASD. Does that surprise anybody? No. That's an improvement from the last CDC report, by the way. It is an improvement. We have a very large gender gap when it comes to autism. And by the way, in terms of terminology, I'm going to use the terms autism, autistic, on the spectrum. I might even say high functioning, all right? So just bear with me on that. And you can see the prevalence over here. 1.2 times among white versus Hispanic children. and 1.1 times among white versus black children. So we have discrepancies. Mary Ellen talked about that as well. So we have groups of children that are being under-identified relative to the population. This has significance for us as school psychologists and significance in general in terms of IQ levels. And you can see a third, approximately a little less than a third, are intellectually disabled, IND. However, what does that leave? A large portion of kids who aren't. So for us as school psychologists and educators, very important distinction, I'm sure you all. And I would also suggest that many of our medical colleagues don't understand the difference between IDEA and DSM. But those are the two on our practices. I remember the DSM-4, the good old DSM-4, right? Umbrella. Actually, I put autism spectrum disorders. It should be pervasive developmental disorders. We all remember that. We had autistic disorder, which was called classic autism at the time. Asperger's disorder, or Asperger syndrome. Childhood disintegrative disorder, RETS, and the catch-all term, PDD-NOS. Most kids seem to fall under that. I'm not sure what this child is, but probably PDD-NOS. Yeah, okay. Asperger's disorder, Asperger syndrome. First emerged in 1994 and became a very popular diagnosis. Okay. Does it exist any longer? Autism spectrum disorder in DSM-5 subsumes you can read, okay. Autistic is, the autistic triad is now a dyad. It used to be 3 factors: communication, social skills, and repetitive and restricted behavior, RRBs, that's what we call them. Now it's 2. They've combined social communication and interaction. Any idea why? Well, all interaction involves communication. And all communication involves social interaction. So it's now combined. Yet we retain fixated interests in repetitive behaviors. Very important. We'll talk about assessing those later on. 3 levels of support for each domain. Each of those 2 domains, DSM-5 now lists 3 levels of support. Level 3 requires very substantial support. Level 2 requires substantial support. And level 1 requires support. So what the DSM has tried to do is to provide one diagnosis, one classification, autism spectrum disorder, and to provide severity levels of support. Makes sense. We no longer have Asperger syndrome or Asperger's disorder. I will tell you, however, and maybe you've experienced this too, now the DSM-5 came out in 2012, 2013. I still get reports of kids diagnosed with Asperger syndrome. Now, trying to get a parent in the family to understand that can be a challenge. So, we try to explain, well, it falls under autism spectrum disorder. My child doesn't have autism. They have Asperger syndrome, to describe that, explain that. And you would also specify with or without intellectual impairment, language impairment, or any other disorder. So that's the DSM-5. DSM-5 added very interesting classification, a new diagnosis, brand new. Social pragmatic communication disorder. And they added this because we saw kids, and we see kids, with social communication problems, but don't have RRBs, repetitive restrictive behaviors. What do you do with those kids? Right? They can't be diagnosed with autism because they don't have RRBs, yet they have pragmatic disorders. Are there any SLPs in here? Probably not. No. Okay. So now the DSM does provide for kids who have pragmatic language disorders, which is a major component of ASD. But if they don't have RRB and cannot be diagnosed with ASD, they can still be diagnosed with social pragmatic communication disorder. To what extent this has had an impact on schools, I don't know. All right, it's a clinical diagnosis, and we all know that schools and IDEA has a very different eligibility requirement. I'm sure you've seen this before. I highlighted the portion that says that adversely affects a student's educational performance. And that's the one section that sometimes gives us a lot of problems. Okay? The kid that has some interesting behaviors, but is not academically challenged in any way. In fact, does really quite well, but is socially isolated, doesn't communicate well socially, has other comorbid, I love that term, coexisting, co-occurring difficulties. This is, to me, one of the most important parts of IDEA, is this portion right here. Prior to this, a student had to be identified before age 3 or age 3. Autism still is defined as a neurodevelopmental disorder which occurs in the first 3 years of life. And so IDEA initially, did not include this. Which, as you know, of kids that enter school who aren't identified. In fact, who aren't identified until 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. When social demands become greater, academic demands are greater, and some of the symptoms are become more obvious as the child grows older. Settings, very interesting. I've had parent come in and tell me, my son has been diagnosed with ASD, autism. Teacher says, does well academically, has a couple of friends. Parent says, well, my doctor says he has autism. That becomes a dilemma, all right? In fact, my doctor says he has autism and he needs an IEP, so I want one right now. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't really have one right now. We don't, you know. We have a sale on them next week, though. If you know. So, but across settings. If you're autistic at home, you're autistic at school. Now, the behaviors may be somewhat different across settings. But nonetheless, you're autistic in both places. If you have a cold, do you have a cold only at school and not at home? I see a question.
Yes. Are there any current major studies regarding the accuracy of diagnosis?
Accuracy of diagnosis? As in what percentage is correct versus whatever? Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah. Underdiagnosis. Right.
Why does the Florida definition not follow either the idea or the DSM-5 in accuracy, but more of a general,
Yes.
broader term? Because to me, it does create issues within the school system.
Yeah. States are permitted to adopt the idea definition using their particular standards. Like, that's what I'm saying. As long as you adopt the basic tenets of the idea. Pardon?
Because it gets the children what they need in the school system.
It may or may not. Okay, it depends on many factors. It depends on the school district. Okay, it depends on, talk about eligibility as well. It depends on many factors, you know, not just the definition. The difficulty is implementing the definition.
Well, I'm sorry, was that last part?
Some of the difficulty in our evaluation is with implementing the definition. Some social performance. And here's where we get into some gray areas, because what is educational performance? Is it only academics? Of course not. Okay. Social communication, interaction. But how do we measure those things? So most of the time we think of education, have a problem. It's never clear cut. The variability of autism, the co-occurring disorders, and we'll talk about that occur at a very high level with autism, make assessment very, very difficult. Not impossible, just difficult. Autism in the schools. Interesting statistic here. .6% of all, how many disabilities do we have under IDEA? 13? 13, yeah. Now ranks fourth. 9.6 of all disabilities, autism. And this is some data from Florida. We have approximately 31,000 children, or 8.58%, of children with disabilities 3 to age 21 receive special educational services under the autism category. Not quite as high as nationally, but in line. And that's the most recent data. By the way, there's always a lag in data of approximately 2 years, sometimes 3. So when I'm citing some of this data, it's It's not today. It's not yesterday, not last month, and it's not last year. There's always a lag in data. Look at number 2. This is from a study that was done. We often call it diagnostic substitution, and I've heard that word. Is it truly an increase in autism, or is it diagnostic substitution? That is, rather than classifying a child as intellectually disabled, we've classified that as with autism. A 65% increase has been associated with decline in number of students classified under the IND category. Now that's very important, obviously. So when we talk about this this large rise, and which translates into the general population of school-age students, we may be talking about diagnostic substitution. This is for between 2006 and 2015. Special education. Number of students increased 165%. And what's interesting too, there's a decline of 27% VBD. Speech and language, surprisingly, a decline of 11%. It doesn't surprise me with SLD. That's been a trend for the past probably 5 years. There's been a downward trend in kids being identified with SLD. Does that mean there's less kids with specific learning disabilities? Of course not. That means less kids are being identified. HI, ADHD, yes. Yes. So that probably accounts for a good part of the increase in other health impaired. Increase. Awareness month every year. We don't need it anymore. Everyone is aware of autism. That accounts for some of the increase. We have better assessment tools as well. Right. The broadening of the definition of autism. And a number of, I can't emphasize enough, our role in educating parents. And I don't want to leave out teachers. If I don't mention this later, I'll mention it now. There's perceived knowledge of autism. It was average. They all felt it. Yeah, we know what autism is. But at closer examination, psychologists educating parents, markers. There are several companies who are marketing method based on we have no blood test for autism. Test kits to pediatricians and claim they have a 90% identification rate based on a saliva swab. What's disturbing about that particular claim is this company calls it a diagnosis. Remember, diagnosis is made on behavioral. Autism is a behavioral diagnosis. Right. So we do have companies that are claiming to identify children and adults based on blood work, blood tests, and saliva. You had a question?
What element are they saying is present in the saliva? Because that should be illegal.
Yeah, a protein, a specific protein that supposedly is related to autism, and that is observed in children who have, or adults who have autism.
And protein is not observed in the general public.
And those who do not have autism.
And it's legal, they can legally.
Yes. And by the way, it's based on one study, their study.
How many people were in the study?
That I can't recall offhand, but it was one study. And in science, it's usually one finding is no finding. You know what I mean by that? One finding is no finding. We need replication, we need confirmation. But you should be aware of that is actively being marketed to physicians.
What about all the research that's been coming out with the eye gaze in the babies?
Mm-hmm. There's quite a bit of that. Unfortunately, we don't have a standardized measure. Plus, that is again a factor. And even though there are more studies that seem to confirm, or at least have confirmed other studies, that there is an eye gaze factor. We could use it for diagnostic purposes at all. That's Simon Baron Cohen, by the way, is yes.
So since we do know that it is, that autism can be hereditary, so when these, in the case of this company that's doing the saliva and the blood test, are they then also testing other members of the family looking for that same, they're not doing any of that?
No. The problem is we know that it's probably 90% genetic factors. We don't know what genes are involved. We don't know what mutations are involved, if any. We simply don't know. Just like we don't know the other 10% of environment. We know, well, some that I mentioned to you, we know aren't involved. But there's no doubt there are environmental factors involved in autism. Most scientists would agree to that. The majority is genetic, but there is an environmental factor. We don't know what it is. Unfortunately, we're consistently bombarded by some of the things I mentioned to you before. You know, pollution, and you probably know, as psychologists, that you can find a relationship between any two things, can't you? Statistically. And you see it in the research all the time. Not so much in peer review, in the popular press. Again, such and such is linked to, such is linked to. Which gives the impression that it's causative. If you're a layperson reading that in the paper, you're thinking, oh my God, this causes autism, when it's a relationship. So it's very important for us to explain that as well. Team approach is absolutely essential. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We can't do it alone. We shouldn't do it alone. Should never. No single measure provides a diagnosis. Assessment of symptom severity, and you'll probably see this mentioned again. One of the primary purposes in assessment, in my opinion, is determine symptom severity. How impaired, I'll use that term, how involved is that child? That has implications for treatment and intervention. So it's not a matter of just deciding, this kid's eligible, this kid's not eligible. What level is this child functioning at? How severe are this child's symptoms? In what area are these symptoms present and how severe? And what do we need to do in terms of intervention, IEP planning as well, which we should all be involved in. Assessment is a continuing process, not a single event. It'd be nice if it could be just a single event, wouldn't it? Let's just sit down, let's just take care of it and get it done. We have heavy caseloads, but it's not. It should be ongoing. Why should we assess? 4 reasons. Symptom severity again. Educational programming. Baseline for progress monitoring. Very important. Is this child making progress? He or she is in a special education class. Is this child making progress? Lastly, determine whether an ASD has been overlooked, misclassified. None of us are perfect, right? Describe comorbid disorders, coexisting, or an alternative classification. So it isn't just a matter of saying, well, let's do an evaluation, see if this kid is eligible, yay or nay, and that's it. No. These will be more comprehensive, really need to understand the child in terms of symptom, severity. Is there a coexisting problem here as well? Likely there is, highly likely. If so, what is it? And what options do we have for intervention planning and or treatment? And you can read that. Keyword here is comprehensive, individualized evaluations. Knowledge, experience, and expertise. Expertise is a weighty word, so to speak, but experience with or autism. Diagnosis. We don't diagnose, do we? Anybody? Really? What do? We determine eligibility, don't we? De facto diagnosis. I know many times I've mentioned the word diagnosis, and school psychologists, we're not clinical psychologists. In fact, we determine a child is eligible for special education under the category of autism. That child has met the requirements for a diagnosis. But anyways, so diagnosis question. To determine eligibility. Eligibility for special education does not replace a clinical diagnosis of ASD. Nor does a clinical diagnosis of ASD determine eligibility for special education. I've often wanted to just put that on a tape and just play it at meetings. They're not interchangeable. They do not mean the same thing. Components of a student evaluation. Behavioral observations, we should always do them. A comprehensive social developmental history, absolutely important. Absolutely important. Comprehensive psychological evaluation, comprehensive speech and language, standardized assessment of adaptive behavior. And an FBA, if necessary. Eligibility. See the little asterisk at the bottom? The student must need special education. And again, that's sometimes the gray area. It's obvious in some cases. It's not that obvious in other cases. Whether a student needs special education. That becomes a team decision. A difficult one. Sometimes it's not. Impairment in verbal and nonverbal language skills and RRBs. I mentioned that before. This is special education law, by the way. I hate that term, special education law. Special education requirements. Use of technically adequate instruments. Nice broad term. We'll talk a little about that. Initial evaluations may not be delayed due to RTI. Who loves RTI here? Nobody loves RTI? Oh. In any of your school districts, is RTI used for autism? No, generally not. I have, however, given presentations to school districts in Florida where RTI is required for autism. Very, very difficult. Very difficult. But that becomes a school district decision. All right. And we'll talk about RTI here. Does not require schools to use RTI to determine eligibility for all disabilities, by the way. Anybody here from Palm Beach County? Okay. What disability categories is RTI required? Do you know? EBD? EBD, SL. What's the other? Language impaired. Yes, language impaired too. I always find that interesting. But the law does not require it. School district requires it. Or the state requires it. The district requires it. The high level of co-occurring problems limit the use and generalizability of the RTI model. That's for autism, but it also goes for, in my opinion, EBD as well. Few teachers receive training on evidence-based practices for students with ASD. I mentioned that to you earlier in a study. While actual factual knowledge was very low, especially about assessment and intervention. RTI is never a substitute for a comprehensive evaluation in determining eligibility for special education. It shouldn't be. Are there districts in which RTI is allowed to be a substitute for determining eligibility for SLD? There are. Yeah, there are. But we're here to talk about autism. Evidence-based practice. And here's a definition. It isn't just best research evidence, for example. It isn't only your professional experience. It's also the individual's values and preferences. It's all of those things. That takes into consideration ethnic values, cultural. Okay. I've had many parents say to me, no, I don't want my child evaluated for autism. Evidence-based practice takes into consideration all. And here we go again. DSM-5 is neither legally required nor sufficient for determining an educational placement. I know this sounds a little redundant, but it isn't enough. Diagnosis is not enough to determine eligibility. IDEA is a controlling legal authority regarding eligibility decisions. It's IDEA. God forbid you should end up in a due process hearing about this issue. But you will find that it will be IDEA as controlling legal authority. Should make sure that the kids meet the IDEA criteria for autism. Doesn't mean you discount the DSM-5. All school stress psychologists should have a DSM-5 in their office. And if you have some spare time and you just want to do some reading, and you'll think that you have just about every disorder in the book. Oh my God, I have that. But you should have a DSM-5. You definitely should have a DSM-5. Two primary elements, assessment and intervention. We're going to talk about both of those. Guides identification, diagnosis, and intervention, this is important, which includes, is not limited to, randomized controlled trials that have empirical support. All right? It's not that rigid in terms of interventions. Part of the problem we have with interventions is taking the interventions that are cited in the literature and the research, translating those into the classroom. You can find translating those into the classroom. You can find many, many, many journal articles that identify interventions that have been shown through study, empirical study, to be effective with kids on the spectrum. Share that with the teacher. The teacher will go, what? Challenging. Very, very, again, another challenge for our position, our role. It's not enough for us to say, challenge for our position, our role. It's not enough for us to say, oh, try positive behavior support, that works. Okay. How do I do that? So, psychometrically sound assessments. I always like to talk about a developmental perspective when we look at kids with autism. Autism is a lifelong disability. You don't outgrow autism, by the way. You don't. There is often improvement with age over time. in terms of symptoms. But it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. You don't outgrow autism. So when a pediatrician tells a parent, don't worry about it, he'll outgrow it. No, it won't outgrow it. Assessment of core areas, we'll talk about those. Information from multiple sources, including direct and indirect observation. And I can't emphasize how important for us to do our own direct observation. Classroom. Anyway, this study that was done 17, so it's fairly recent. It was a survey of nationally certified school psychologists about their it was done 17, so it's fairly recent. It was a survey of nationally certified school psychologists about their practices in determining autism, and less than 25% used a comprehensive developmental assessment approach. A majority reported using brief screening measures such as the GARS. Everybody knows what the GARS is? We'll have some nice words to say about the GARS a little bit later. And the GADS. Everyone know what the GADS is? I've seen that used today. Anyways, it's the Gilliam Asperger's disorder scale. Yeah. The ADOS, ADIR, CARS-2, and SCQ were used less than a third of the time for ASD assessment. Those measures are empirically supported, have good psychometrics, and are recommended for use in evaluating kids on the spectrum. Less than a third.
Where does the ASRS come in there? I'm just curious.
I'm sorry, the ASRS?
I don't see it up there, so would you consider it a good?
Yes, we're going to talk about the ASRS, yes. Yeah. And I don't like to use this term, but I will anyways. Gold standard. I hate that term, gold standard. You know, the ADOS is considered the gold standard. How many of you have been trained on the ADOS? Oh, good. Okay. ADIR, anybody use that? And it can be lengthy and time consuming, and given our referral loads, it can make it very difficult. The CARS-2, anybody use the CARS-2? I'll have some very nice things to say about the CARS-2 a little bit later. The SCQ is a social communication questionnaire. Anybody familiar with that? Good, we'll talk about that too. Okay, psychometric properties. We should all know about these. Do we all like statistics? Who likes statistics? Oh, good, okay. Sensitivity. It's a percentage of cases with a disorder, autism, the other disorder, that test positive. Okay. Specificity, the percentage of cases without a disorder that test negative. Right? Make sense? All right. We know what a false negative is. And you know what a false positive is. Positive predictive value is another value. That's the power of an instrument to identify a disorder. We'll talk a little bit less about that. Sensitivity matters in a lot of things, but it matters in tests, in psychometrics. Recommend values of 0.80 or higher are generally recommended. A highly sensitive test means there are few false negatives. An efficient assessment tool, we should minimize false negatives. All right, so when you're looking at an assessment instrument, you want an assessment instrument with a high level of sensitivity, because there'll be few false negatives. And after all, that's what we want, right? We want to identify those kids who have autism. We don't want to misidentify them. We want to identify those kids who have autism. We don't want to misidentify them. So if you use a test of sensitivity, you're going to misidentify kids. You're not going to identify them. Period. Okay. Let's do this. Before we start multi-tiered screening, is everybody's attention span okay, or would you like to take a 10-minute break? Everybody okay? Great. No? Yes, you're good. Okay. Even as adults, we have various limited attention spans. Okay, here's a multi-tiered screening idea. I have used it. It's an idea. Tier 1, and I've broken it down into tiers that you could use. Am I in your way? Blocking. Okay. Tier 1 is case finding, recognizing risk factors or warning signs of ASD. And often that doesn't necessarily come from us. Comes from teachers, comes from parents, may even come from administrators, other individuals, all right, who may approach you with some information about a child that is concerning. We call them red flags. We may call them red flags. Tier 2, we do some screening. Now, these screening scores, again, used as an indication of approximate severity of ASD symptoms. We share these screening results with parents and school-based teams with a focus on intervention planning, ongoing observation, and progress monitoring. Okay. Now, for Tier 3, those kids who meet the threshold in Step 2 may be referred for an in-depth assessment. Oh, there's that gold standard mentioned again. Okay. When I talk about Tier 2 interventions, what I'm talking about here is education and information, accommodations in the classroom. Okay. Does this child continue to display the severity and the problems after you've talked with parents, you've talked with teachers, you've made accommodations in the classroom, you've implemented support, other accommodations in the classroom or interventions in the classroom. Those kids are not responding and still demonstrate those red flags that may be associated with the core symptoms of autism. We talked about those. Language impairment, lack of social skills, RRBs, okay, atypical behavior. Then we might move to Tier 3, which is a comprehensive developmental assessment. All right. Now, here are some screening tools. There are others. Hence the term select screening tools. I select it. Okay. I've listed the sensitivity for you. Remember I said 0.80 and above? ASRS, Everybody knows what that is? Okay. That's the short form screening form. There's a screening form. It's a short form, not the long form. 15 items are taken from the long form that have the most accuracy in identifying students on the spectrum. Social communication questionnaire is for the parent. There are two versions of that, lifetime for the parent. And it asks questions such as language development, social skills. It's yes or no, 40 questions. The SCQ was originally, the questions were taken from the ADIR interview. All right, so there are 40 questions. The SRS2 has 65 items, parent or teacher, sensitivity, and the time to complete. Those times are approximate. It obviously depends on the individual, but those are the times. What's notable about here, these screening instruments, is the sensitivity, high levels. But remember, they're screening. It's not an assessment. That's simply screening. And may have a low screening score, but continue to demonstrate over time some of the core symptoms of autism. All right? So we need to keep that in mind too. The screening instrument doesn't necessarily identify every single kid as high risk or at risk. So what that means, if a student doesn't identify every single kid as high risk or at risk. So what that means, if a student doesn't screen high, but teacher, parent still demonstrates concern, your direct observation still is concerning, you still monitor that student's progress. And we don't walk away and say, well, that's, kids' screening results weren't significant, so we won't go any further. You might go further. You might go further later. Student may have to be screened again with another instrument. So. Now, I know this looks a little overwhelming, but these are the components of a comprehensive developmental assessment. Can we do all those in 45 minutes? No. Remember, it's a process. It's a process, and often a long process. Are there shortcuts? Shouldn't be. Shouldn't be. Certainly there are ways of combining resources. Remember, you're working with a team as well. So this is not just us. All right, so working with a team can also reduce the amount of time we're involved in the assessment process. Assessment issues with kids on the spectrum, and I'm sure you've evaluated kids, autistic kids with autism, and their behavior can be very variable, as many other kids in an assessment situation. But sometimes we have difficulties with distractions, inattention, By the way, ADHD is a very significant coexisting factor with autism. So we have a problem with that. We have a lack of a normative base for ASD. You may have difficulties in sustaining reciprocal conversation. Perspective, everybody know what perspective taking is? Because perspective taking is very important, often called theory of mind. This is from Simon Baron Cohen as well. Theory, and by the way, there are two types of empathy. I'm going to digress a little here. Two types of empathy. We often hear, people on the spectrum, they really don't have much empathy for others. It's a myth, a big myth, unfortunately, a popularized myth. Two types of empathy: cognitive empathy and affective or emotional empathy. All right. Folks on the spectrum tend to have difficulties with cognitive empathy. They don't get what you mean. All right? They have difficulty understanding what you mean. For example, there are 3,000 idioms in the English language. We all know what it means. It's raining cats and dogs. We know what that means, right? Or wait till the cows come home. Say that to some kids on the spectrum, or even some adults on the spectrum. Very confusing. Raining is like cats and dogs. I had a kid say to me, cats and dogs don't rain. You're right. It's an idiom, it's an expression. In terms of active affective empathy, autistic folks have empathy. They may not always show it in a typical fashion. They may be over-empathic, clingy, who cry at just about everything that upsets them. Or they see someone else upset. They get very upset. All right, so autistic folks do have empathy. All right. Some of the theory of mind and the cognitive empathy is a problem. Really taking your perspective. Understanding maybe that you're angry with them, that you're upset with them, or that you're pleased with them. Okay. So I think that's important. Gender differences. We have a very large gender gap in autism. Remember? How many boys to girls? 4-1. And by the way, I don't know how recent this study was. It wasn't too long ago that boys are referred 10 times more often than girls. Now, I don't know how often you see that in your schools, but I know that most of my referrals were boys, not girls. If I did get a referral for a girl, it was usually due to anxiety, depression, isolation, social isolation, without any thought that it might be autism or might be related to autism. Well, girls camouflage better. In general, girls have better social skills. In general, they have better social skills. They're usually identified, as I mentioned before, with other problems: anxiety, depression. rather than autism. Yes.
I think also, they still see boys as, they're supposed to be out and socializing with girls. Are
Correct.
supposed to, the girl sitting alone or reading, that's normal,
Yes,
so they don't see that as an issue.
you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. Yeah. Certain activities that girls might engage in might be seen as normal, including play activities by themselves that aren't seen as particularly out of the ordinary. And one larger issue too, boys who have concurrent behavioral difficulties or are very atypical, different, stand out in a classroom. They're more apt to get the attention of a teacher. Okay, so boys are more noticeable. The symptom demonstration, if you will, boys are more way symptoms are demonstrated in boys and girls are very different. And they're much more noticeable in boys than they are girls, which probably accounts for the difference in referrals. And when you have a difference in referrals, then you have a difference in prevalence also. Lower symptom severity scores for girls on measures also. There's a qualitative difference in social connectedness and reciprocity. Boys and girls are different. Interesting. Higher functioning girls are less impaired than boys. Okay. So this should tell you something also. So if you have a higher functioning girl in your classroom, she's going to appear to be less impaired than a boy who's going to have more symptoms. So they may not be as noticeable. Certain test items are more typical of girls than boys. And the big one is number 2. Over-reliance on a male model. That's getting better. But in the past, on test measure, symptomatic of boys as opposed to girls. So naturally, more boys have been identified. So we have a gender gap, and it's an important gender gap because girls who go unidentified have many risk factors. Depression and anxiety are the main ones, particularly in teenage years, where the incidence of depression and anxiety increases considerably for girls versus boys in teenage years. So girls who are unidentified are at higher risk for psychiatric disorders. So what I always say to teachers, if there's a girl in your classroom who seems to spend a lot of time by themselves, their face in a book, doesn't seem to relate to other girls, seems a little down, a little anxious around others, you might want to consider a referral. Yes.
And I hate to say this, but isn't this also symptomatic of society with females? The females in general in society that, we've been less than males in a lot of areas. Male models with more tendency towards males and females that we've been left behind. This is not really unusual.
Is that there are gaps. I like to use that term. In autism, it is a very large gap. Talking 4 to 1 How many girls are classified EBD? Many? Some? But mostly boys, aren't they? And D categories. Boo-hoo for us, you know.
What is the requirement? Significantly different.
It is,
Or more?
in general, I don't know.
Significantly different.
It is different. It is different. Yeah, it is different. You know, for autism, it is indeed, you know, 10 times higher. So you can imagine for other disabilities, the most disability categories, the majority of students are male. That includes SLD, EBD. I don't know the percentages, but they're mostly male. Maybe it's that chromosome thing. Okay, I'm going to talk about autism-specific measures here, all right? I'm going to focus on those measures that are specific to autism, not in general, but are more relevant to autism. Parent caregiver interview. Can't specify this enough. Talk to the parent. We need to have a developmental history. You really have to have a developmental history. Who knows their kids best? Parents. You don't always get accurate information from parents. We know that. But that depends on our interviewing skills also, okay? We need to have good interviewing skills, develop good rapport with parents. But we need to talk to parents. We need to know about a child's early developmental history. Remember, autism usually appears the first 3 years of life. Okay, so we need to talk to parents. Parent-teacher ratings. Where do kids spend most of their time? How many hours a day are kids in school? 6, 7, okay. So we need parent and teacher ratings. And they're typically questionnaires. Direct observation. I mentioned that before. We should observe the child as well. We really need to see that child. It isn't enough to listen to the parent, listen to the teacher, see the kid for 15 minutes, or even see the child during an assessment. You need to see the child in unstructured situations, playground, I mentioned the cafeteria, other times, really in other environments. Again, some select autism-specific measures. ASRS, SEQ, SRS2. Are you familiar with the SRS? Anybody? It's a very good instrument. It's a very good instrument. ASRS is as well. Now, I mentioned about the cars too. I asked if any of you have used it much. I had someone say to me the other day, yeah, I'm going to use the cars and I'm giving handing out the rating scales to the teacher and parents. Excuse me? No. The cars is for us and other professionals. The reason why I like the cars, I've gathered all the data from multiple sources. And if I have the time, and if I have questions relative to autism, I like the cars. I combine that information along with my observation, with my background, my experience, what I know. I complete the rating scales. And it compares those ratings with other kids with ASD. That's why I like it. Do I use it all the time? No, of course not. But there are times when you have information and it's conflicting. That's not uncommon. Get a parent report, no problem. Get a teacher report, severe problems, vice versa. You've observed a child, you're still not sure, you want to observe them again. You have checklists, you have a physician's report, gathering all that data, all right? No opinion out there. Yes, I believe this child has autism or is autistic, based on including my direct observation and the multiple sources of information that I have. So that's why I like the cars. The ADR is time consuming, 1 to 2.5 hours. Very difficult, it just is. If you don't want to use the ADIR, use the SCQ, Social Communication Questionnaire with a Parent. Takes 10 to 15 minutes, 40 questions, yes, no. Ask questions about early development. It asks questions about repetitive interests, social skills, interaction with others. The SCQ, by the way, is one of the most studied or investigated of all these measures. There's a lot of has really good sensitivity, good with parents. Parents find it very easy to fill out. It's only 40 questions, yes or no. You can give it to them, you can sit there with them, depending on the situation. So that would be an alternative to the ADIR. The ADOS, of course, only if you've been trained, and we all know that the ADOS is not a standalone instrument. An ADOS does not give you a diagnosis. An ADOS doesn't include developmental history. In fact, the ADOS sometimes gives you only limited availability or limited ability to identify RRBs. In other words, a child may not demonstrate RRBs during your administration. Even though you can score it, you may not see it. So that becomes a problem for the ADOS. Any questions on those? Okay. The SRS-2, by the way, has a preschool version and a self-report for older kids and young adults as well. Okay, I don't want to pick on the GARs, but I'm going to. Now this is the GARs and the GARs too. Look at the sensitivity. Very, very poor sensitivity. I do not recommend the GARs for use in determining eligibility, specifically for determining eligibility course, I would never tell anybody not to use any instrument. The GARS may be appropriate for a quick screen. You might want to look at individual items on the GARS and how the student responded. That would give you information. I'm not saying it doesn't have utility. I'm saying it has very poor sensitivity. And there are better measures to use than the GARS for assessment purposes, to include in a comprehensive developmental assessment. The GARS 3 does represent some improvements. However, we don't have enough data or study yet to demonstrate its utility in the general population, okay, or with autism. Really don't have enough information yet. So we really don't have enough information yet. So again, I'm not picking on the GARS, but I am. Do any of you use the GARS? Don't. Yeah, that probably wasn't a good question to ask, was it? After I just, yeah.
I won't anymore now.
I'm not suggesting that any measure you should or should not use. You should be aware of the sensitivity. Read the manual. You be careful with that too. But you should read the manual. Do a little research. Look at some journals. Look at some online journals, and look at sensitivity. See what the sensitivity measure is, and how effective it is in identifying kids on the spectrum. I haven't gotten any letters from Jim Gilliam, so I'm sure he doesn't care. It's still a very popular instrument. Social communication, core feature of ASD. And we all know what pragmatic skills involve, right? Some of us have very good pragmatic skills, and some of us don't have such great pragmatic skills. They vary. Pragmatic skills, changing language according to the needs of a listener or a situation, understanding non-literal language, and I mentioned to you the idioms, very important, and following rules for conversations. I'm sure you can think of kids after reading this who like, really? You didn't understand what I just told you to do? I gave you very clear rules and what I expected. Didn't understand it. Or why are you giving me a totally inappropriate answer to the question I just asked? It's pragmatics. It's maybe other things also, but it could be pragmatics, especially if it's consistent over time. So for our SLP colleagues, assessment should include an evaluation of pragmatic competence and not be limited to the formal structural aspects of language, articulation, receptive and expressive language. So when we're working as a team, SLPs do understand that pragmatic is so very important. Expressive language is important. Certainly receptive language is important. But receptive language is a measure of pragmatic language.
Do you have specific measures for the SLPs to measure that pragmatic competence?
Yes.
Yeah, I find them asking a lot.
Yes. I'm glad you asked. Ask and you shall receive. Some speech and language SLPs that I've worked with have used the comprehensive assessment of spoken language. Test of pragmatic language is very popular. These two, the social language development test and the children's communication checklist, are less popular. But if your SLPs aren't familiar with them, I would suggest that they do. I'll mention this last one here. This is Jim Gilliam also. He's better on this. Pragmatic language skills inventory. It's a checklist that you can give to teachers. I have used it in my evaluation. It's brief. It isn't diagnostic, but it does tell you whether there's some pragmatic problems here with this kid in the classroom. And what I do is I share that with my SLP. Sometimes I include it in my report as well. But when you're giving out behavioral checklists to teachers very often, it doesn't take very long to give. And I'll sit down with the teacher and say, have you noticed any language kind of difficulties, misunderstanding, so forth and so on? Would you complete this for me? This will give me a pretty good idea of whether there's some pragmatic kind of problems. So I think the Pragmatic Language Skills Inventory, the PLI, PLSI, that you can use in your evaluation. At least I have comfortably, right? And it's not impinging on another specialist's area. We are not SLPs. So this is information you can share with your SLP. RRBs, overlooked all of the time. Nah, most of the time. It's a core diagnostic feature of ASD. Sometimes it can be difficult to identify these behaviors. Other times they're very, very obvious to any observer. And you usually get responses like, that kid has some very strange behaviors. Why do they keep doing this repetitively? All right. Repetitive speech, motor movements, use of objects. And of course, lining up objects. Excessive adherence to routines. It's a big one. Autistic kids typically do not like change. Well, let's face it, none of us like change. But autistic kids really don't like change. Transitions are difficult. Moving from one activity to another. In schools, moving from the classroom to music, art class, for some kids, can be very difficult. Can result in tantrums, other types of unwanted behaviors. Highly restricted or fixated interest, that abnormal, I don't like the term abnormal, but that's how it's identified, that's how it's defined, in intensity and focus. I've worked with kids who have had an intense interest in very strange things. I had one kid who would watch, the only TV show he would watch was the Weather Channel. Seriously, only the Weather Channel. Would throw a TV show he on the TV, if he was in the room, it had to be the Weather Channel. Challenge. Okay. And so there are other restricted, fixated interests. All right. I also know of, and while this may seem to be normal, to use that term, often boys will be interested in cars, depending on their age. Right? 4 or 5-year-old cars. Right? 4 or 5-year-old cars. Right? I've worked with a youngster who has literally a closet full of cars and plays with them incessantly. And once he begins to play with his cars, getting him away from his cars for dinner or anything is a monumental task for the parent. And very disruptive. Sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between a real interest in something. I really like this, and a real interest, and something that's fixated, and that's restrictive. And restrictive means just what it sounds like, to the exclusion of other things. Okay. And I don't have to mention computers or screen time, do I? Not that. Hypo or hyper reactivity of sensory input. Unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. I was once observing a kid on a playground, and I don't know why this is, but that day I happened to wear a tie. I usually don't wear a tie. So I had a tie on. And I'm walking around, and I'm just observing, and I'm walking. And this kid's social skills weren't too bad. Okay? He was familiar with me. I'd been in his classroom. I'd seen him before, met with him before. And he walks up to me, and he says, "Oh, nice tie." Very adult-like. Pedantic speech, by the way, is sometimes another symptom. And he takes my tie, and he decides he's going to smell my tie. And he's standing there, and he's smelling my tie. I said, "Well, that's enough." He said, "No, I'm not through smelling your tie." And I said, "Well, you're going to have to stop smelling my tie because that's it." It's a very unusual sensory characteristics. It can relate to smell, touch, and we're finding out that sensory issues are very much related to kids who on the spectrum who have troubles eating, picky eaters, the sensory, the texture, the smell. Okay. Some kids won't eat certain foods because of their textures and their smell. Sometimes you observe this in younger kids who aren't on the spectrum. But there's some kids, some autistic kids who have a real aversion to certain foods. And one parent who the only thing his kid would eat is either mac and cheese. And I know a lot of kids, that's all they're ever eating, mac and cheese. But this kid would only eat mac and cheese or some other kind of pasta. And the parent would have to bring in the food into the cafeteria, or the kid would have a tantrum when the kid went to lunch. He would not eat anything else served. And that was a challenge you can imagine, both for the parent and the school. Of course, who doesn't love mac and cheese? But not every day at every meal. Okay, how do we measure RRBs? Well, there's some broad-based scales. The ASRS and the SRS2 do have measures of RRBs. Okay. They do have questions. Okay. Them. The SRS has a treatment scale. And for unusual interests, unusual sensory processing as well. But these are broad-based scales. Very important scales. I would recommend using them and looking at the profile. But if you want to go more individual, take a real individual, you may even get on one of the broad-based scales that it isn't a serious problem. Remember, this is a core symptom of ASD. You can't have ASD without RRB. So there are two, repetitive behavior scale and the repetitive behavior questionnaire. There are two. There aren't very many. Those are the two that are individualized. They will tell you more about the type of interest or behavior, the intensity, and whether it falls with, whether it's normative or whether it's atypical.
Which one do you like best?
I like them both, but I like the repetitive behavior questionnaire, the RBQ. Has been revised as RBQ. I don't recall the publisher, but that's very easy to find. Now, of course, this all centers on time, doesn't it? Because you're talking about an additional measure here. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Oh, adaptive behavior. I call it a core assessment domain. Absolutely need to have an adaptive measure. You should have an adaptive measure. It's on the spectrum between their measured intellectual ability and their adaptive. And we all know what adaptive behavior is, correct? It involves many domains. In fact, research tells us adaptive behavior in child is a strong predictor of outcome, regardless of symptom severity, language ability, or IQ. It's your ability to, it's life skills. Simple as that. Simple as that. Good example. I can attest. Yeah. Yeah. Adaptive behavior. The ability to adapt to situations successfully. And the kids on the spectrum, autistic kids, often have a great deal of difficulty of doing that. Getting along with others, communicating appropriately. In other words, demonstrating age-appropriate adaptive behaviors. So it's a core, I could consider it a core assessment domain. Should always be included, I feel, in an assessment for ASD. Now here's some measures. The Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales is the most frequently used. And I'm sure you've used it, seen it. Vineland, highly recommend it. It actually has an autism scoring. It can be scored on an autism, has an autism scoring norms as well. Adaptive behavior assessment system. Behavior assessment system for children, 3rd edition. I put this down here. How many of you use the behavior assessment system for children? Use it a lot? Use it a lot? It's a broad-based measure. Does it have a scale for autism? No. What's the scale called? There's a scale. it has a, it's not called autism, it's called either atypical behavior, okay? It refers to behavior that is not normative, all right? In addition to anxiety, because it's a broad-based scale, depression and so forth. I say use caution when comparing it with the VABS or the ABIS. It's a broad measure. And here's why I'm saying this. I would suggest, and I've seen this before in reports, where the adaptive measure has been the behavior assessment for children. The psychologist, all right, I suggest that you not do that. It takes less time, and you have the information there if you've already given it. But you should really use an individual specific measure, a narrow band measure for adaptive behavior. And any one of those would be appropriate. I would recommend the Vineland. And there are various forms of the Vineland as well. If you're short on time, the adaptive behavior assessment system does have a parent version that is relatively brief. The parent can complete, check. But the Vineland can be done, there's a teacher form as well as a parent form, and there's an interview form. If you have the time to sit with a parent and interview the parent, it's absolutely the best way to do it. But I do realize that time is a constraint, can be a constraint. Here's some additional domains. Pretty good. Behavior emotional problems. Ooh, executive function. We love that term, executive function. Memory, attention, family system, motor skills, and sensory processing. These are all areas that are important in an assessment. They may or may not be problematic, but most often they are. Comorbidity. I once said that to a parent, and I thought they would, faint. Like, my God, what do you mean by comorbidity? Sounds terrible. Excuse me, co-occurring. As high as 70 to 84% for one or more disorders, 30 to 40 meeting the criteria for two or more. Highly significant, highly significant. So when we're doing an evaluation for autism, we're not just talking just autism. We're talking comorbid condition. We're a child. Most common are internalizing problems, anxiety and depression. And of course, ADHD, disruptive behavior disorders. I added catatonia. Anybody know what catatonia is? Okay. The DSM-5 no longer recognizes catatonia as a separate diagnostic category. However, DSM does mention catatonia as a specifier for autism or ASD. It's usually seen in adolescence, early adulthood, estimate, and it can result in a severe form, complete mutism, deterioration of self-help skills. And I've had parents report that to me, that their kid has all of a sudden seemed to, their teenager, take care of themselves, their self-help skills, their hygiene. So I've added that. Something to be aware of. Like if you're dealing with middle schooler or high schoolers, and a kid's on the spectrum, and all of a sudden you see a deterioration of behavior, you may be talking about comorbid catatonia. Okay. Children with ASD and clinically significant ADHD symptoms experience greater impairment in adaptive functioning and a relatively poor quality of life. The message here, if you have a student identified with ASD and ADHD, the problems are going to be more severe. Anxiety. 40 to 50% of kids have an anxiety disorder. Here's the most common co-occurring disorders. Specific phobia, obsessive compulsive disorder, and you can read the rest. Any idea what the number one, by the way, this study was from a focus group of a large number of parents who reported on their autistic child's fears and phobias. And they were grouped and classified. Any idea what the number one specific phobia is? Crowd, not number one, the crowds is certainly one of them. Toilets. Toilets. Followed by vacuum cleaners.
Oh, the automatic.
Yeah. Thunderstorms.
Oh, yeah.
Was it all toilets or just those self-flush?
All toilets flushing.
Either
Either,
it's self-flush, we have some students that are definitely afraid of them.
yes. Well, they're scary.
What about the fire ones?
Yeah, any sudden sound, but thunderstorms are particularly problematic. Yes. Yes, and these are the fears, fears and phobias. But vacuum cleaners are always high on the list. Actually, any mechanical objects. All right, and here's one that is, at least for me, is a little disturbing. You know what I mean? They're rather loud, and I don't know if they bother you, but they're just very noisy. Anxiety disorder, you would expect that. Agoraphobia. Generalized anxiety, separation anxiety disorder, and panic disorder, in that order. Some broad measures, again, behavior assessment system for children. And the Achenbach. Anybody use the Achenbach? Yeah, a lot of people haven't used it in years. It has been revised, by the way, the anxiety scale has been revised to correspond to the DSM-5. I've used the Achenbach as well. And it has a DSM scale, which is helpful. And here's some self-report measures. Anybody use the revised Children's Manifest Anxiety Scale? I've used that. That's a good measure. Okay. I'll mention the Spence Children's Anxiety Scale. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. It's a freebie online, by the way. Take it. It has good psychometrics. Pardon me? Yeah, has good psychometrics. There's a parent and a child version. So just take a quick look at it, see what you think. Okay. More severe deficits. Comorbid autism and ADHD is debilitating for many kids. And a challenge for evaluators, challenge for parents, challenge for teachers. We know what executive function is, correct? Frontal lobes. Very important to all of us as we sit here. Being able to organize, being able to focus, be able to pay attention, be able to process information. Very, very important. Planning, inhibiting, inappropriate response, and so forth and so on, including self-monitoring. All right. So we're looking at some estimates. Some studies have suggested that approximately 80% of kids on the spectrum have executive functioning problems of varying degrees, some more than others. So I've included as an important issue. If you add it of EF, it does add some important information and can assist you with planning. All right, so when you think of autism, think of executive function. What other disorders of executive function? ADHD. Yeah. So I think this is an important area that you might want to look at, and there's some measures to look at. The brief, who uses the brief? Yeah. Very popular, can be used in your assessment for autism. Has good psychometrics. The comprehensive executive function inventory is relatively new. Right, you may see that or you may have that. I've included the wide range assessment of the RAML, wide range assessment of memory and learning. Although not technically executive function, it does a good job of evaluating memory. Okay. Long-term, short-term ability to process information effectively. Anybody use an EPSI? Not too many people do. Okay. Tends to be a little bit more labor intensive. Delos Kaplan, but the behavior rating inventory of executive function is user friendly. So I do use that quite often.
Which one did you say is the best one to test for memory?
The best one for what?
Test with works with memory?
The RAML, wide range assessment of memory and learning. So,
Okay.
yeah, that's one.
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah, the third one. Yeah. So the reason why the brief is user friendly is because it's worded very well. The questions are worded well. Parents find it fairly easy to fill out. So do teachers. So, and it does give you information to include in your report, to include in relating information to parents and to teachers as well. Let me just go back here for a minute. On the brief, the areas that are usually most compromised, you can guess which ones they are. Cognitive flexibility. Yeah. There's some research that suggests that nearly every scale on the brief is elevated with kids with autism because their executive function is compromised. But it's mostly cognitive flexibility. Sensory processing. 78 to 90% of kids on the spectrum have sensory issues. By the way, there is no such thing as a sensory processing disorder. Please. Why do we seem to add disorder to the end of everything? And I'm not sure why that is. I've had parents say to me, my kid doesn't have autism, they have an auditory processing disorder. I said, well, who told you that? Occupational therapist. I said, okay. A disorder specific criteria that is not shared by other disorders. Sensory processing is shared by a number of disorders, including ADHD, attention deficit disorder. There are kids who have no disorders that have sensory issues, strong responses to odors, textures, whatever it might be. So if I read one more thing about sensory processing disorder, I'll scream. Anyways, this is the DSM definition, hypoactivity sensory input, and you can read the rest. Indifference to pain, heat, cold, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, remember my tie, fascination with lights and spinning of objects. That's just a general broad definition. And I'm sure you can think of other sensory issues and problems that you see with kids. And here's the sensory profile. Anybody familiar with that? There's a short version of this, the short sensory profile, which I have used. Very quick, very easy. Give it to the teacher, give it to the parent to fill out. Give you an idea about sensory issues in the auditory area, visual area. Just gives you some good information. Very easy to, very quick. And the sensory processing measure is also a very good measure. It's longer, gives you a lot more information. Now, of course, we don't want to step on OT's toes, okay? Because a lot of what we're talking about here have been typically within the domains of occupational therapists. All right, but I do think we as school psychologists, if we're looking at a comprehensive developmental assessment for autism, we need to look at all core areas, not only the core areas, but those areas that are relevant to autism. And if we're talking a 70, 80 or higher percentage of kids that have sensory issues, I don't think we should just ignore that. Because you'll hear it from parents. You'll definitely hear it from parents, and you'll hear it from teachers. Loud noises, in particular. Well, now we come to the fun part. Evidence-based interventions. Here are two sources, and I would urge you, if you're not familiar with them, is to take a look, okay? Take a look online. National Autism Center and the National Professional Developmental Center on Autism Spectrum Disorder. University, I think it's University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. National Autism Center, both of those have evaluated the empirical evidence about various interventions. And they develop a list of interventions that have been shown by research to be effective with kids on the spectrum. They're by means, not the only ones, but they're ones that had sufficient data NSA identified 14. The NPDC identified 27. All right. Well, both were conducted independently. One common finding, and you should have guessed this. You read them a lot in the popular media. And I'm sorry to say that modified diets aren't considered an effective intervention. Now, I will say this. I gave this presentation to a mixed group, similar presentation to a mixed group. And afterwards, I had a number of parents tell me I was wrong. I said, okay. I'm only reporting. Don't shoot the reporter. You know, I'm only reporting what the evidence tells us. Anecdotally, it may have had some benefit for your child. That's all, you know, I mean, that's all I can tell you. Sensory integration therapy? No. Auditory integration training? Absolutely not. No support. You laugh at that. I have had parents ask me about that. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy. In fact, you can find some articles that support hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Unfortunately, they are seriously flawed in any number of areas from a research perspective. Neurofeedback. A lot of advertisements regarding neurofeedback for ADHD, autism, just about everything. There's no conclusive evidence that neurofeedback produces positive results in kids on the spectrum. Facilitated communication, do you know what that is? Know what a Ouija board is? Okay. That was discounted years ago, but to this day, I hear about it. What he's really trying to say, you know. But those are just some I've included. There are many, many others. But I included the diet because it's very popular. And you read it all the time. You know, doctors will tell their patients, try a a gluten-free, casein-free diet. Unless your child has a food allergy, that's different. I'm not talking, you know, if you have a food allergy and you have celiac disease, you're obviously having a gluten-free diet. But as a general recommendation to parents who have kids on the spectrum, one thing it does, and what concerns me with modified diets, they're restrictive diets. And autistic kids often have a restricted and limited diet to begin with. Remember I mentioned to you? Only eat specific foods, won't eat certain vegetables, so forth and so on. So now if you restrict their diet even more, you're going to have troubles with nutrition. So, and I always tell parents, I can't tell you how to raise your child. If you're a doctor, you know, just make sure that your child is getting sufficient nutrition, because you're eliminating a lot out of the diet, out of your child's diet. Again, unless your child has a food allergy. If you're lactose intolerant, that's different. Oh, treatment integrity. Everybody know what that is? We might know what it is, but we don't do it too often. But we should. It's an important link between the use and effectiveness of interventions. It's the accuracy and consistency with each step of a treatment or intervention plan is implemented or intended. So if I give someone an intervention plan, let's say self-monitoring. Everybody knows self-monitoring, self-management. Okay, there are steps. So if I give a teacher or I give you this intervention plan, and I sit down with you, and I say, you go through this step, and you do this step, this step, this step, this step, and I walk away, and you skip step 3. Maybe not intentionally, but you didn't have time. Oh, I don't have time for that. Skip step 4. Okay? That's low treatment integrity. The plan is not implemented as intended. So we won't know whether that plan worked or not. What if it failed? It may have failed because you skipped steps 2 and 4. We'll never know. So that's why all intervention plans that we recommend, and if you're recommending an intervention plan to a teacher or a parent, I usually like to spell it out. I'll have a checklist. Do this, did you do this, did you do this, did you do this? And you establish rapport, and you like to meet with them and say, how did you do? How did it work today? How did it go this week? Did you go through the steps? Did you miss any steps? If you did, what can we do to fix that? Maybe the teacher ran out of time at the end of the day. Maybe there wasn't enough time to send home a report to the parent. Whatever the case may be, we need to work on it. But what's more disturbing is, this is from Skolnick not too long ago, only 18% of research studies in school-based teams assessed and reported treatment integrity data. What that simply means is we're sitting around recommending interventions and not knowing whether they're implemented as they're planned. And so sometimes when interventions just don't work, we go, I don't know why they didn't work. Well, there could be a reason why they didn't work, because they weren't followed. This can be labor intensive also. But if you're working with individual case, individual teacher, individual parent, highly suggest that make an effort to gather treatment integrity data. You really should.
How do you do that? But I think that's a big problem in our schools, especially when you're looking at SLD, eligibility too, when you're looking at fidelity monitoring. The only thing that we ever look at really is administration going in and doing an observation or a walk through the classroom when that's being performed. How do you formally gather that data from a teacher?
The best way I have done it depends on the intervention. The more complicated the intervention, the more difficult it's going to be, obviously. I tend to think very complicated interventions are doomed to fail from the beginning. Okay. Simpler isn't always better, but in terms of interventions, start with something you know the person can do. And of course, that assumes that you know this individual and you've assessed their skills, basically, what you feel they can reasonably do. To give a teacher a complicated intervention plan is going to fail from the beginning. Teacher's going to look at it and go, oh yeah, I'll try that. Okay. What I usually do is a checklist. And I start out very small. And when I meet with the teacher, and I say, okay, here's the steps to the intervention. Okay. And what I'd like you to do on a daily basis, if you can, is once you've done it, anytime during the day, check it off. And the next time I'm around, because we're itinerants, right? Don't you love that term? I'm an itinerant. Next time I'm around, let's find some time to go over it. And let me know, email me, if you're having any real problems with this intervention. In other words, if it's just not working, tell me now. Let's not wait. So, that means you have to establish rapport with the teacher. I know we're all different personalities. There are some teachers that are going to buy in. Some teachers are going to work very, very diligently with you. And there are other teachers that are going to say, that's not going to work. I tried that. I already know that. I've done that. It doesn't work. And That's part of our challenges. I don't know if that answers your question or not. But there has to be some, we have to have some way of monitoring it, other than, yes, I did it, no, I didn't do it. No, and that's really the best way. Start small.
Excuse me, I guess in defense of teachers, we are not purposefully difficult. We have time constraints.
Absolutely.
And I
Yes.
mean, where I work, if I can't catch someone in the hall, I can't go to the ladies' room. So it's not as though we're just ignoring what you request. You know, we don't have, we really don't have time. It's not a joke when you say that. So if you send us something, if you could email it, in addition to giving the paper copy. You know, because there are those times in the middle of the night, God only knows why we wake up and check the email. But we do, and say, oh, I forgot to do that. So if you could also email it, that would be very helpful.
And you're correct. And you're absolutely correct. Teachers are very busy people. Schools are busy places. And school psychologists come around once a week. You know, so we have often a limited access to teachers.
And we like you to come around because it's an adult conversation. With somebody who's not, you know.
That's always nice.
Yeah, come around.
That's always nice. Yeah. Stop in. Do any of you ever have lunch in the teacher's room, faculty room? Just asking. It's usually an interesting experience. My dad. Okay, here's some classroom strategies and supports that have been shown in the literature and anecdotally from my experience and others, colleagues, that have been effective. All right. Obviously, assistive technology. Now we're talking about kids with significant communication problems. And you know, your SLP may involve a student or provide assistive technology to a student. And that can range from high tech to low tech. And that's another topic. Occupational therapy, peer mediated strategies, and you can read the rest. Positive behavior support, speech and language, story-based visual schedules and supports. All right. I'm not going to go through an explanation of all of those, but these have been implemented with some success in the classroom. Okay. Once again, it depends on the individual, the student, individual teacher, school psychologist, what's possible in the school. Here's some key points. And these basically is what we've covered. Point this out again. RRB is a core diagnostic.